Martin Zubimendi, panic over. Plus, we're going to talk about Benjamin Sesko's asking price and lots more on this episode of the Chronicles of a Gooner. Thanks for joining me. Hey, everybody. How are we doing? Welcome back to another live episode of the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast with me, your host, Harry Symeou. Tuesday morning, sipping on my coffee, feeling a lot more relaxed today than I was sort of in the morning yesterday, where we were talking about obviously some of the stories that were doing the rounds. We were discussing Martin Zubimendi's performance for Spain against Portugal in the Nations League final. We were then having to discuss these suggestions that Real Madrid had come in and hijacked this deal, or were at least attempting to do so. And we were discussing the possibility that Arsenal might lose out on what was clearly one of their primary targets going into this summer. Sounds, though, as if the panic's over. And we did bring you that update yesterday on the Chronicles of a Gooner's bonus podcast. We put a clip out as well in which I said to you guys that Arsenal, having done a bit of digging, remain very, very confident that they're going to sign Martin Zubimendi this summer. And lo and behold, we got a post from the brilliant David Ornstein, who's far more reliable than me and should be listened to always rather than me. But he said, Arsenal regard the Martin Zubimendi move from Real Sociedad as, and I quote, done and signed. The 26-year-old Spanish midfielder is expected to report at the start of pre-season. Real Madrid sources say that while they like the player, they never actively pursued a deal. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting how things get planted in the media, how stories can catch fire and can cause a great deal of panic and a great deal of frustration among a supporter base. And actually, at the end of the day, seems like, and of course, until we get that official confirmation as fans, there's always going to be that little bit of worry and concern. But it looks as though this is as good as done, and there's nothing to stress about and nothing to worry about. And instead, we should be turning our attention now to trying to get some other deals done in other areas of importance. We know that we need that centre forward. We're going to talk about Benjamin Sesko in a bit, the latest on that. We also know that we probably need to wrap up the Thomas Partey situation sooner rather than later, because if we don't, we're probably going to have to go back in the market for yet another midfield player. So there's a lot to be getting on with. There's a lot to be done. And that's why when you hear of one, if not being officially wrapped up, at least very, very close or heading that way, it's great, isn't it? Because it means that you know that the club can now start to shift and focus their attentions onto something else. And, you know, we've been saying for a long, long time that Real Sociedad would prefer for this deal to be ratified in July for accounting purposes. And that was confirmed by the Athletics piece this morning. So that remains the case. Nothing's changed. And listen, to be fair to those who initially broke this story, your Sammy Mockbells, your David Ornsteins, etc., their faith in Arsenal getting this done was unwavering, because they obviously had that information. And despite some plants in the likes of Marca in Spain, for example, and despite some noise coming out of that side of the deal, it looks as though these guys were very, very confident that this was done from a while back, and they've never wavered in their faith, in their information. And so, yeah, I'm really pleased that it looks as though this is heading in the right direction. Just interestingly, on the Real Madrid side of things, the Athletics Real Madrid correspondent, Mario Cortejana, I think that's how you say it, says sources in Madrid have been very, very assertive in saying that the 15-time European champions like the player. And obviously, we talked about this yesterday. Xabi Alonso has that relationship with him. He's a Spanish international. Real Madrid will always look at the top of the class in Spain. But they did not pursue or actively work on recruiting him. Now, that's probably, if they like the player, you'd imagine and you'd assume that's because Arsenal have had this thing in the bag for quite some time. We heard about it as early as January. And at the time, people were very kind of skeptical of that report, weren't they? A lot of people were kind of pushing back and saying, oh, well, look, we're not going to get a striker. And they're trying as a football club to put this out there now, so that what that means is that the rage levels in terms of not getting that striker are just dealt with ever so slightly by the fact that it looks like, okay, maybe we're going to not do a great deal in this window, but we're doing that partly because we feel like we're ready to go in the summer with some big deals. And Martin Zubimendi represents a big deal. There's no question about that whatsoever. According to this piece in The Athletic as well, The Athletic's transfer deal sheet, I think it's called, really, really good informative piece, comes out very regularly. And it's my go-to in terms of trying to collate all the information ahead of these podcasts. But it does say that Arsenal are to pay around 65 million euros for Martin Zubimendi. Now, this is interesting because his release clause was thought to be around 60 million. So Arsenal are paying more than the release clause to get this deal done. Now, why, you might ask? Well, the reason for that, and I've talked about this before, and I'm pretty sure I touched on this right back at the beginning when we were linked with Martin Zubimendi. I said, look, he's got a release clause. And I think I talked about something very similar with Benjamin Sesko. Players have release clauses, but if you want to pay in installments, then you are going to have to negotiate anyway. So, we talked about La Liga being the example with Zubimendi and Sociedad. If he's got a 60 million euro release clause, the only way that you can bypass Real Sociedad in this conversation and in these negotiations is if you go to La Liga and you deposit the 60 million euros and you say, we're taking the player's registration on. Thank you very much. The registrations, as I understand it, are owned by La Liga rather than the clubs. There's some quirk in the rule. It's different to here, right? So what that means is, as I say, if you want to bypass Real Sociedad, if you don't want to engage in any negotiations with them, no problem. Go and pay the release clause. Go and deposit the release clause to La Liga, and you will get your man. Or at least you'll get the opportunity to speak to your player and try and, proceed with a deal. In order to get him in any other way, though, you'd need to speak to Real Sociedad, and that's what we've done. And this has been going on for a while because clearly Arsenal didn't want to deposit 60 million euros all in one go. And in a summer where we've got multiple transfers that we need to be doing, where we've got multiple positions that need addressing, this makes sense. If you can get this better deal, I say better in terms of the way that you're going to pay that price. I mean, for example, people take finance on stuff all the time, right? People sometimes have the money but prefer to spread that cost out so that they don't feel it as much. This is what Arsenal have done here, because Arsenal, I think, really do know and understand that internally that they've got a lot of business to be getting on with over the course of this window. So how do you do that? Well, you've got to give Real Sociedad some incentive. You can't ask them to accept a deal in installments without them getting any benefit from that. So what's the benefit that we've offered them? What's the carrot that we've dangled? We've agreed to pay 5 million euros more over the course of that period. That's the interest, if you like, that Arsenal will be paying in order to get Real Sociedad to agree to this set of payment principles. So we're going to pay a little bit more than I think people were anticipating, than people were expecting. But if doing it in that way allows us to maneuver a little bit more freely in all the other sort of bits of business that we need to do in the window, then I'm absolutely fine with that. So Arsenal, according to this piece in The Athletic, to pay around 65 million euros to get Martin Zubimendi in. But it appears as though the panic's over. Real Madrid not actively pursuing this, despite having a and an admiration for the player, which is what we told you yesterday on the pod. But Arsenal, it seems, have a clear run at this now. And according to David Ornstein and the others very, very close to this story, have been reporting and keeping us up to date on this story throughout, this is, and I quote, done and signed. So panic over. They also mention in the deal sheet piece that Arsenal are among those to keep an eye on this week, with work being carried out on a new striker and a wide attacker. Sesko, Gyökeres and Watkins, they say, have all been prominent in Arsenal's thoughts. Williams, Rodrygo and Gordon all have admirers at Arsenal too. So there's lots of names being talked about at the moment. The one that people are most excited about is obviously going to be Rodrygo. The reasons are obvious. Track record, plays for Real Madrid, one of the real superstars of the European game, and probably someone who could, I think, really thrive in an environment like Arsenal, where he'd have a little bit more weight because we don't have a Kylian Mbappe or a Vinicius Jr. And in an environment where he could probably play in his preferred position, therefore probably play to his maximum, which is, look, he's great at Real Madrid, but I don't think you always get the maximum out of him because he's playing on the right-hand side. And I think he would be probably the first to admit that. But it's interesting that some of these other names are not going away. The Victor Gyökeres thing is not going away. I'd imagine that that's something that Arsenal are sort of, keeping tabs on just in case they aren't able to get Benjamin Sesko. I think the feeling is now that Sesko's the number one target, and that's where we're going to move towards, and that's who we're going to try and sign. But we heard yesterday, didn't we, that Gyökeres had been approached via intermediaries by Manchester United. Now, Andy Mitten, who's a very, very well-respected journalist, covers Manchester United and covers them really closely and really well. I've met Andy on a few occasions. He said on TalkSport's Transfer Insider show last night that he'd spoken to people within the Manchester United hierarchy, that he'd done his due diligence, he'd done his research, and Victor Gyökeres' name was not one that was mentioned to him. Now, that doesn't mean that the Gyökeres to Man United links are completely false. I think it makes perfect sense that United would be exploring the possibility, given Amorim's relationship with the player, given the way that coach and player have worked very well together in the past. But the kind of red flag for me, and we touched on this on the bonus pod that we did yesterday when we covered off this story, was if Manchester United are struggling financially, and listen, we know they're a massive football club and a massive entity, and they can probably find ways of generating money and doing deals, when they really, really have to. And maybe they found other ways of financing this stuff in order to try and really kind of give Ruben Amorim the best chance of succeeding and in the shortest possible window of time. But I looked at it and I went, hold on, they've signed Matthias Cunha. They're trying and pushing to sign Brian Mbeumo. What, they're going to sign Victor Gyökeres as well? Like, that came all a little bit as a surprise to me, to be honest with you, just because it felt like they had identified their forwards already and they've got moving with that. So we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen with Victor Gyökeres. But somebody laughed at me in the comments yesterday for saying that if I'm him, I'm waiting. I'm waiting to understand what the situation at Arsenal looks like. Because if Arsenal decide against signing Benjamin Sesko, or that deal falls through for whatever reason, you get the feeling that they would pivot to Victor Gyökeres. And I really would prefer to join Arsenal over Manchester United, given the state of the two clubs currently. Like, it's a no-brainer. Someone said to me in the chat, well, yeah, but Man United wins it. Mate, no one wants to play for Man United over Arsenal right now. Nobody. And why would they? On Benjamin Sesko, who we touched on and mentioned there, it's interesting because we've been talking a lot about what it's going to cost to get him. We've been talking a lot about what things are going to look like in terms of the financials there. Would it be something that we could do in installments? How much would we need to pay up front? What does Benjamin Sesko's release clause actually look like? Because it's been reported as various different figures actually over the last year or so, and it's very difficult to get a handle on what exactly it looks like. So we got to wait and see, I guess, what Arsenal are going to deal at here. But Simon Collins reported yesterday that the RB Leipzig are looking for £70 million. So £70 million. Let me just do my quick bit of maths again. Hold on. £70 million in euros comes to about 82 million euros. So there was some suggestions the other day that it was between 80 and 100 million euros that RB Leipzig were looking for. I said to you guys it'll probably be towards the lower end of that. And it looks like they're after 70 million euros, which, as I say, comes to about 82 million pounds. Let me say that again because I've tied myself up in knots there. I said to you the other day that the rumors and the reports were telling us that RB Leipzig wanted 80 to 100 million euros. And I said that we'd probably deal towards the lower end of that. So around about 80 million euros, which translates to about 70 million pounds. So 82 million euros is 70 million pounds. So if we pay 82 million euros, essentially, we would get Benjamin Sesko. But what does the structure of that deal look like? The truth is, no idea. Not sure. We also heard some suggestions yesterday in the evening that Saudi Arabia were interested in Benjamin Sesko, and that they'd made, as Fabrizio Romano put it, I think, an important proposal. We hear a lot of that, don't we? Saudi trying to do deals, putting in important proposals. Basically, they're throwing bundles and bundles of money at people. But most players have no desire and no interest to go there at this stage in their careers. And rightly so, because the standard is way below what they could be playing. Now, I do think that the Saudi Pro League is probably better than what most people give it credit for, because we've got this preconception of what it's like. And, I think people often overlook the fact that a lot of top quality players have got up and gone over there, obviously for the financial reasons, first and foremost. I'm not saying, we should rate it, or I'm not saying that, it's an attractive proposition outside of the money, but it's a more attractive proposition than maybe people ever give it credit for, just because of that opinion that we have around the way the Saudi Pro League has risen to prominence, the way that they've gone out and hoovered up top talents from around the world. But I'm not in the slightest bit worried that Benjamin Sesko is going to say, actually, do you know what? I don't fancy the Premier League. I don't fancy Arsenal. I'm going to go over to Saudi Arabia and play there. I don't worry about that with him. I might be silly, I might be naive, but that's just the way I feel about it. Let's move on to a couple of other stories, a couple of other bits and pieces, and then we'll, of course, pick up in the live chat as well, as we always do. The Athletic also reported this morning that you can expect some clarity on the future of Thomas Partey in the next few days. If he departs, Arsenal will need to enter the market for a replacement. Now, fingers crossed we do hear about this sooner rather than later, because if we are going to need to recruit, I think it's important that we get going with that as early as possible. I've got to say, over the last few days, I've just grown a touch concerned about this Thomas Partey stuff, because, listen, I've said all along that if you bring in Martin Zubimendi, I'd rather you go and bring in a top quality midfield player than you bring in two that are maybe not quite at that level. If you lost Thomas Partey, you definitely need to bring in a second one. So my preference all along going into this summer was keep Thomas Partey on a contract that works for us, but obviously works for him as well. You need to find some kind of middle ground, understand that. But for me, that feels like the sensible way to do things and to manage this transition that we do need to go through in the middle of our pitch. So in doing this, it not only allows us to continue with Thomas Partey, who's a very, very good player and had a really outstanding season last season. There's no question about that. But it also allows us to bring Martin Zubimendi in without that pressure of needing to come in and start dominating the midfield from day one. And it's a bit like what I've been saying with Sesko and Havertz, that dynamic of, yes, you're bringing in a good player, and that's great. And I'd imagine that when you're bringing in that player, it's with a view to them eventually being a starter in the team. But to have players that are already occupying those positions that can help them, aid them, assist them in terms of getting their feet under the table and getting used to the new surroundings, I think is a real good thing. And so to have Partey and Zubimendi, it's an upgrade on having Partey and Jorginho. And we've got in Martin Zubimendi a player that can hold down that position for many, many years to come. So I think that's the perfect outcome for Arsenal. Obviously, the contract terms are going to be key here in how I feel about this. But if I take that out of the equation for a minute, if it's just about football, then it is the right thing to do. But for such a long time in the kind of build up to the end of the season, we were hearing, no offer's been made yet, but Arsenal do have an intention to keep Thomas Partey. And as soon as the season ended, it felt like that was going to be really accelerated and we were going to progress on that quite quickly, providing us with some clarity around how our midfield's going to look and what we would need to do going forward. But we're 10 days into the window, and there is still no news, no word on whether Thomas Partey is going to stay or not. And the longer this rumbles on, the more you hear about the likes of Barcelona being interested, for example, the more you start to worry that actually this might not be heading in the direction we thought it was. I want him to stay, but if he's not going to stay, we need to know sooner rather than later. So if I were Arsenal, I think I would have put some kind of deadline on this. I think I would have made him an offer. And we did hear that, a while back, Arsenal made a competitive offer. That's how it was put. I think I would have put the offer on the table and I would have said, this is the deadline. Not because we don't want to keep you, not because we don't think you're an asset to the team, not because we don't value you, but because if you are going to go and leave us up shit street, we are going to have to go out and identify another midfielder, negotiate a deal for that midfielder, figure out how that midfielder would fit into our squad, figure out how they would work into the wage structure, etc., etc., etc. You would be giving us a hell of a lot of work to do, and we need time to do that work and then execute any potential deal that we identify. So I think it's really important that we get this wrapped up sooner or later. My gut feel is that Thomas Partey will stay, and I hope he does. But obviously, we're not at a point where we know that for certain right now. So there's going to be a little bit of a concern around that. There's no question about that. It's also said that Mikel Arteta would like to bring in another centre back this summer. We did try for Howson from Bournemouth. So this does make some sense. There was a want to sign him. There was an effort and an attempt made to try and bring him in, but he couldn't resist the lure of Real Madrid. And it is said in today's piece that if they do enter the market for that centre back, Mark Guehi of Crystal Palace is very, very high up the list. Now, this is interesting because Mark Guehi was the subject of some really high value offers, wasn't he, from Newcastle United not that long ago. And credit to Crystal Palace, they dug their heels in, they stood their ground, and they made sure that they kept hold of a player that was really, really key. And they've gone on to win an FA Cup. They're obviously having this back and forth right now about whether or not they can participate in Europe because of some of the rules and all the rest of it. But it's just been an unbelievable season for Crystal Palace. So their decision to stick with Mark Guehi very much vindicated, but they haven't been able to time down to a new contract, which is a problem for them. And so you've got clubs like Arsenal and various others who are going to be put on red alert. He's a good centre-back. He came into the England side in the Euros. There was a lot of concern about that particular position in the team. I thought he did great at the European Championships. And here he is now going into the final year of his contract, still a Crystal Palace player. What that does mean is that he should be, and I quote again the Athletics piece, considerably more affordable as a result of those circumstances. So maybe, just maybe, Arsenal look at him as an option and make a move for him. What I will say is, if he is going to be, and I quote, considerably more affordable, we will not be the only ones circling, because he's got a great reputation. He's done brilliantly in the Premier League. He's shown that he can do it on the international stage as well. He's a player who is due a move, with all due respect to Crystal Palace, onto bigger and better things. Maybe if they are given the green light to compete in Europe, which I hope they will be, I think they should be, maybe he will sign another contract. We don't know, but he is someone that there is an interest in from Arsenal, according to the Athletic this morning, which I find interesting, because centre-back wasn't very high up my list going into the summer, especially after Jakub Kiwior put in the displays that he did in the Champions League in particular. So, yeah, it's interesting that we're still exploring that possibility and exploring the central defender market. But, hey, we'll wait and see how that goes. Right, we're going to take a short pause. We're going to touch on two more very, very brief stories, and then we're going to take your questions and thoughts from the live chat. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the Chronicles of a Gooner.
You're listening to the Chronicles of a Gooner. Like and subscribe.
That's right. You're listening to the Chronicles of a Gooner podcast with me, Harry Symeou. Like and subscribe. We've got over 830 of you with us live right now, but we've only got 100 likes on the board. There is no reason why we shouldn't have 500 likes on the board by the time we end this live stream. Come on, guys. It doesn't cost a thing. It really, really does help. Also, subscribe to the channel if you're new as well. We're pushing forward towards the next milestone, and I'd love to get there sooner rather than later. Also, if you're a patron, thank you very, very much for your support. We've had a few new signups over the last few days, for which I'm very, very grateful. If you're interested in signing up to our Patreon, you can do so via the link in the description, patreon.com/the Chronicles of a Gooner. We've got a Benjamin Sesko scouting piece there with video, which we're not allowed to do on YouTube, but we can get away with over there. So go over and check that out. Plus, we've got a Martin Zubimendi one coming your way as well very, very soon. So get involved, patreon.com/the Chronicles of a Gooner. Leave a like on the video if you're watching us on YouTube. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, leave us a review. Right, let's cover a few more stories. Arsenal are still on course to land Kepa Arrizabalaga from Chelsea for £5 million. We heard just the other day that Arsenal were accelerating their efforts to do this, that there had been significant progress made in that preceding 24 hours. So this one very much still on course to happen. We've talked about what a smart and good bit of business this feels like. Let's hope that it proves to be exactly that, but there's no reason to worry or be concerned about that. It does feel as though there is work being done behind the scenes to get that over the line. Reiss Nelson, who of course went out on loan to Fulham last season, suffered a really bad injury, but who's now obviously an Arsenal player again and whose future is up in the air, is the subject of interest once again from Fulham. And Fulham are interested, according to The Athletic, in exploring a deal to bring Reiss Nelson back to the club. I hope he gets that move. I really feel sorry for Reiss Nelson. I think he's so much more talented than he's ever been able to show, just because of the injuries and some of the opportunities that have maybe been limited because of the other players that we've had within the squad. Whatever happens with Reiss Nelson, he'll always have that Bournemouth goal, won't he? Always. But yeah, look, I think it's time for him to move on. I said it last year. I think there was an appetite to move him on. I think there was an appetite on his part to go on to become a permanent fixture somewhere. Obviously, the loan thing was all we could figure out at that time, but then the injury really did hinder him. I think Fulham would be definitely signing him had he stayed fit. I think they're willing to explore a deal now, though, to see how that might look. And if everybody's happy, then he's got a good home there down in West London. And just finally, I want to touch on this. It's not Arsenal related, but I do want to touch on the news that Tottenham are working to appoint Thomas Frank as the new boss. He'll replace Ange Postecoglou, who won the UEFA Europa League with Spurs, but was sacked just a couple of weeks later on a basis of their really poor league form. And it was really poor league form. And I said it at the time, I thought Spurs were right to sack Ange Postecoglou. I thought they were right to part company with him. Thomas Frank, this kind of kills me a little bit inside because I really like Thomas Frank, and now I won't be able to want him to do well anymore. I've probably told you guys this story before, but I think it was either the first or second, maybe possibly third game I ever covered as a football reporter. I went as a written reporter, and I went down to Brentford's home, Griffin Park at the time, and Thomas Frank was the manager. And I remember going in and being completely lost. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to talk to. I didn't know if I was allowed to ask a question in the press conference. I didn't know if it was, pre-organized. I just had no idea. And Thomas Frank, I thought was fantastic. He went around the room, spoke to every reporter. Okay, it was Brentford in the Championship. There wasn't as many reporters as you get at an Arsenal game, so it wasn't quite as overwhelming. But he made an effort to come over to me to say hello, to introduce himself, and he asked me if I had a question. And I thought, oh, wow. Like, I was not afraid, but I didn't feel it was my place when all these really established reporters who cover that club on a weekly basis were asking their questions. And Thomas Frank went out of his way. I then subsequently interviewed him 5-6 times as a BBC Radio London commentator, reporter. And I've always liked him. I think he's been incredibly pleasant. I just think he's a fantastic guy. And I think he's done wonderful things with Brentford. I think what Brentford are doing, staying in the Premier League, a club of that size, with all due respect, it's the stuff of miracles. And I really do fear for them once Thomas Frank goes. I understand why he wants to make this jump. It's a jump up to a much bigger club. There's no question about that. And who can blame him for taking it? But my one reservation here, if you were to look at this from a purely footballing perspective, take the Arsenal hat off for a minute. Will he be successful or will he not? I think my concern is that at Brentford, he's operated in an environment that was built specifically to his wants and needs. He has a lot of influence over many different departments, and it just feels like it's the perfect fit for him. It's the perfect relationship. Take him out of Brentford, put him somewhere else where there are going to be more chefs in the kitchen, if you like, where there are going to be more complicated relationships to navigate with the club's hierarchy and some of the other people making decisions at White Hart Lane. Is he going to be as successful, and is he going to be able to cope with the pressure? There's no pressure at Brentford. If Brentford stay in the league every season, that is success. That's not going to be the case at Tottenham. So I think this is a bit of a risk. I really, really do. I really, really do think that this is a real rolling of the dice by Tottenham Hotspur. And it kind of shows you how far they've fallen despite winning the Europa League, because a few years ago when they were looking for a new manager, it was Jose Mourinho or Antonio Conte. And now it's Thomas Frank. And I love Thomas Frank, and I think he's a fantastic guy, and he's done an excellent job at Brentford. But you can't deny his CV. It doesn't exactly stack up to those of some of those previous managers I've mentioned. So it's a big gamble for Tottenham, this. And I hope, well, I was going to say I hope it works out for Thomas, because I really, really like him, but he's managing them, so I don't really, to be honest with you. But anyway, just wanted to touch on that story. And we are going to bring you some content as we build up towards the new season, where we're going to cover stories right across the game with guests like we used to. We used to do a show called The Social Club, if you remember, and we used to get guests on, and we used to round up the weekend stuff, and all of that is in the pipeline again. And I'm looking forward to tying down some guests to participate in that regularly, hopefully over the course of the summer. Talks have begun, is what I'll say on that. But anyway, let's go over to the live chat. Let's take some of your questions and your thoughts to wrap up the show. Guys, come on. I don't want to have to do this again. We need more likes on the board. Hit the like button. It really, really does help. So if you haven't done it already, it doesn't cost a thing. Get involved. Lots of you agreeing with me on the Thomas Frank thing about maybe not having that pressure at Brentford. Manny K says he didn't have the pressure to win at Brentford. Daniel says he'll be sacked in 2 years' time, quite possibly. Joseph says, I think Thomas Frank will be a success there. Very intelligent, and I'm worried he'll do well. Interesting. Hacker says, I don't think the players are good enough for Frank's tactics. They can only play Ange ball. Technical players are expensive, and it's Spurs, so there's a conundrum. Interesting stuff. Anyway, that's enough about Spurs. Should we move on? Let's go over to Afsar, who says, are you worried about the Sesko to Saudi link, therefore bumping up the price, and the Gyökeres link to Manchester United? Could we miss out on both primary targets? Honestly, at this stage, no. I'm very, very confident that we're going to sign Benjamin Sesko. I'm not even sure that the Saudi links are legit. Have they been planted to try and drive the player's price up? Maybe. But if you go by everything we've been reading and hearing, it sounds like there's a really good relationship at the moment between Arsenal and RB Leipzig. There's a respect, and there's a real kind of, there's a desire, I think, on both parts to do this deal. Like RB Leipzig have missed out on the Champions League. They could do with a big cash injection. Selling Benjamin Sesko will give them that. I'm sure the player feels like it's time for him to move on, and Arsenal really want the player. It makes sense for absolutely everybody to get this deal done. I think that because the negotiations have been, if not formally ongoing, but those conversations have been taking place for such a long time, I don't think they're going to be influenced at this stage by rumors that Saudi are interested. So no, I'm not massively worried about that at this moment in time. Daniel says, who do you want, Sesko or Gyökeres? If you'd have asked me 2 weeks ago, I'd have said Victor Gyökeres. If you ask me now, I'll tell you I don't mind which one, because I've done a bit more digging and a bit more research. And I think they both have things to offer. So let's see. Let's see how that goes. And look, it's one of those where, again, I kept talking about the fact, didn't I, that football doesn't need to be that binary. You could be happy with either one. You can like Sesko and like Gyökeres too. Like, it doesn't mean that if you like Sesko, you have to think that Gyökeres is crap and vice versa. Jid says, if it's Zubi and Partey in the base of the midfield, what happens to Rice? He'd play left 8 out of necessity more than design last season, and seeing he's right-footed, our style wouldn't suit him there. I think Rice is going to be the left 8 moving forward. And I agree with the kind of sentiment of your point where you say that you prefer a left-footed player there. You made a comment yesterday, didn't you, where we talked about how that role has changed a little bit and what that means for the wingers since Granit Xhaka vacated it, left-footed player. And obviously Declan Rice has taken that on a little bit. But look, Declan Rice was just incredibly effective in the second half of the season doing that, getting forward, scoring goals, contributing big moments, being aggressive, powerful. He brought a lot to the table in that left 8 position in the latter stages of last season. And so I'm now more confident that he can play that role and we can get the best out of Declan Rice. My only thing is that if it is Martin Zubimendi that sits at the base of the midfield, or an aging Thomas Partey, and he is aging, and he does have fitness issues from time to time, and he does struggle with the pace of certain games and certain fixtures. I think Declan Rice's role is not quite the out-and-out 8 role that people will make it out to be going forward. I think if we bring in that more conventional centre forward, who, look, if it is Benjamin Sesko, he will drop deep, but probably not as deep as Kai Havertz does. And he'll probably be instructed to stay high and be that focal point because of his physical power and all the rest of it. Then I think that means that the 8 doesn't have to go and make those runs beyond the 9 all the time, in which case the 8 can be more of an 8/6 and support Martin Zubimendi in the middle of the park whilst taking the lead off of Martin Odegaard a little bit more. And I think that's probably where Arsenal will go with this. So just to explain that a little bit more clearly, I think with an out-and-out number 9 up front, there's less of a need for our 8, our left 8 specifically, because Declan Rice does this a lot, to make those runs beyond the centre forward. Instead, they'll play a more conventional midfield role. They'll be partly there to support the 6, and they'll be partly there to get forward and be an 8 as well. So I think what the end game is to get Declan Rice playing a more kind of hybrid role between an 8 and a 6. And that's where I think he'd probably be at his best, because that's been an ongoing debate, isn't it, about what he does best. In actual fact, maybe we should just try and get him doing a bit of both, and that'll probably bring the best out of him. Fuad with an interesting question. He says, why do you think the pool of centre forwards in world football is so dry these days compared to 10 or 15 years ago? Do you think perhaps the way football is played now has driven kids away from that position? Yeah, possibly. Possibly. I think because it is such a system game now, and there's so much fluidity in a lot of these systems, the centre forward role doesn't feel as kind of glamorous and as appealing as it maybe once was to young kids growing up and playing the game. Instead, you always want to score goals and you always want to impact games, but you see wingers now, don't you, impacting games just as much, coming in off the flanks and scoring goals. And you see centre forwards a lot of the time now doing a lot more selfless work, doing a lot more work for the team. So yeah, maybe it's just lost its shine and glamour a little bit, and that's impacted that. Carrie says, is there people in the media who purposely lie about transfers? I don't want to sit here and call anyone a liar, because I think that's disrespectful. And I don't think you can call people liars if you don't know that for a fact. But there are stories that are planted in the media for effect and for reasons that maybe us on the outside probably will never fully understand. So, you get people saying, this is happening, this is my information, giving it to a source, knowing the impact that will have on, sort of those people that are following that story and that transfer very, very closely. But I'm not going to sit here and say that people actively go out of their way to lie. I think you get a lot of people guessing. I think you get a lot of people trying to go early on stuff, so that they can point back and say, look, I said it before X, Y, or Z. But it's more important to be accurate than it is to be early. So are there liars out there? Maybe, but I'm not going to sit here and say X is a liar or Y is a liar. What I will say is that we do get stories planted in the media deliberately, sometimes, like we were talking about that Saudi stuff, to drive prices up, sometimes to force a club's hand into a negotiation. Let's say you're trying to sign a player up on a new contract. There's not really been a breakthrough. You're struggling. You're at a bit of a crossroads. And then a story comes out and says Barcelona are linked with X player. All of a sudden, as a club, if you start to worry about that, that is obviously going to weaken your hand, isn't it, in the negotiation? So I do think stories are leaked, not leaked, planted. But I don't think people are just sitting there just making up lies for the sake of it. At least they shouldn't be, and not with the people I've worked with anyway. Mr. Feather, what kind of question is this? Do you think the main reason Arteta wants Sesko is because he wants to parent him like a toddler? No, I think Mikel Arteta will want the player, A, with the higher ceiling, and B, I think he'll want the player that he feels he can mold into what he needs him to be as successful as he possibly can be in our system and in our team. So it's not about treating him like a toddler or like a kid. It's about doing what's best for your team. And when you're making a big investment like that, you want that investment to serve you well for a number of years. And obviously Arsenal feel that Benjamin Sesko can do that. Right, guys, I think I am going to leave it there. Thank you all so much for joining me on this episode. There won't be a bonus episode this evening unless something major breaks, and I get to it a little bit later on. It is my 8th wedding anniversary today. So I'm going to take the wife and kids out for dinner later. Yep, anniversaries have the kids included now as well. I'm going to take the wife and kids out for dinner this evening. So if I do anything later because something major breaks somewhere along the line, it will be much later, like after 8 p.m. type thing. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining me on another episode of the pod. I really appreciate it. I love this. This is fantastic. Manny K, get the Barry White playing. Oh, yes. Love it. Thank you so much. And thanks for all the kind messages as well. I wasn't saying it for congratulations. I was saying it just to let you not know that there won't be a 5 p.m. ish type show today like there has been over the last few days. But look, thank you all so much, and I'll see you all on the next one, whenever that is, whether it's tonight, tomorrow. Like, subscribe, leave us a review, all those amazing things. And yeah, thank you for your wonderful support. Until the next one, take care of yourselves and up the Arsenal.